Today's Doctor Who Series 11 episode review is of course going to be of episode 6, which is Demons of the Punjab, written by Vinay Patel. Now this episode is one of which that is once again right up my street, because it is a historical story in a historical setting that we've not really seen Doctor Who actually go into before. It is great to actually see a Doctor Who historical that isn't completely limited to British history, because we've seen a lot of Victorian London in the past. However, we've never really gone to other countries and actually experienced some of the pivotal points in their history, and I think that this story is certainly one of those that from the offset looks incredibly interesting. Those of you that have seen my previous Doctor Who Series 11 episode review, you'll of course know that last week's episode was the Saranga Conundrum, which I think that this story kind of had a very easy job of basically being better than the previous weeks, because I didn't really like the Saranga Conundrum whatsoever. It was certainly a rather negative episode review, if anything, certainly the worst story of the series so far in my eyes, meaning that this episode was a rather nice refreshing breath, seeing the Doctor go on a brand new adventure back on Earth once again, which is something that must be said we have been rather focused around throughout the majority of this series. So this is of course the 6th episode of Doctor Who Series 11. We are nearly at the very end of this series already. We only have 10 episodes this year, then we also have the Christmas special or whatever is going on with that, of course at a later date, meaning that we are very much nearly at the end, and it only just feels like it has started. But hey, I guess it's best to have Doctor Who in small doses as opposed to having too much at once, meaning that generally the quality will probably be a lot lower. Taking a look at the behind the scenes for this episode first, featuring the talented people that actually worked on this story. So to start off with, the episode was of course written by Vinay Patel, which I think it is clear that this story is very personal to him, of different religious beliefs, and I think that it is a great idea to involve his personal beliefs and religions within Doctor Who, and I think that it really does nicely make for an interesting story. It's good to see a different religion actually kind of exercised throughout Doctor Who, because we don't really have much of that. Of course, earlier on this season we did have Rosa, which is currently in my top spot as the best episode of this year, and a lot of people were worried that Rosa and Demons of the Punjab were going to be incredibly similar. However, to me, I think that both of them do incredibly different things. To start with, the settings are completely different, of course, giving the obvious. Rosa was of course mainly around racism and Rosa Parks and the whole events around the civil rights movement. However, this story has a little bit of a different orientation around it, and it is the equivalent of Doctor Who Series 11 does Father's Day from Series 1 once again. When I was watching this episode, even my dad picked up on the fact that this episode was basically Father's Day, just with a few of the elements changed, such as the characters and the location, but the actual general premise of the story is very, very similar. You have somebody who is from that family going back in time to see one of their relatives when that relative doesn't in fact know who they are, and they need to look like an innocent bystander why this rather heart-wrenching event does of course take place. And I think that given that, it's not really an original story. I think that the actual general ideas around this episode, such as being given the watch and the whole story almost being centred around the story behind that watch, it is almost stereotypical historical time travel. I think that if I was to create a standard stereotypical science fiction movie, that will be the idea that I will go around it, artifact that has some story behind it that the protagonist then goes back in time to actually figure out what happened and why it ends up in the state that it does, and kind of the relevance behind it. See, I do think that Vinay Patel has certainly contributed an interesting story, but not necessarily one of the most original that Doctor Who has seen, certainly so far for this series. The director for this story, we do have Jamie Childs once again stepping in, which was the director who directed the first episode of the series, The Woman Who Fell to Earth, and once again, much like how I had compliments for episode 1, he did a brilliant job throughout this story. It looked very visually pleasing, very colourful. I loved the landscapes used. There was a lot of wide angles to really nicely represent the location that they are in. I think the fact that this is a shoot from a different country, I certainly praise Doctor Who Series 11 for using different countries and their locations. Once when it came to Doctor Who, I actually felt like I was witnessing a story where the companions had actually gone back in time to this other country. I kind of physically believed it. It made this episode look very visually stunning, and I loved the different sun sort of flares that were coming off different scenes as well. It was really nicely directed. Briefly taking a look at the other production credits for this story, script editor Fiona McAllister, produced by Alex Mercer. As per usual, the executive producers are Chris Chibnall, Matt Strevens and Sam Hoyle, and the music was composed by Segan Akinola, and the general running time is of course 50 minutes, much like the previous episodes in this series, and that is basically it. The one thing I want to say for the production is generally it looks a high quality, looks very nice, but also at the same time I am so relieved to finally be out of this Chibnall obsessed phase that we've had. 5 episodes, not including this one this season, that have all been written by Chibnall, apart from Rosa, written by Mallory Blackman. It was kind of co-written, but I think the majority of the ideas did come from Mallory, meaning that the two, arguably one of the most standout episodes of this season, was written by another writer, and all the kind of mediocre dud ones are written by the new head writer. So yeah, it's nice to have a new writer's actual perspective of the 13th Doctor, which we'll be coming on to in a little bit. And I'm just grateful that the rest of the episodes this season, minus the series finale, are written by somebody else. And ideally, I would like the Christmas special, if it happens, to in fact be written by somebody else also, because there isn't really any rule behind the head writers needing to write the Christmas specials. It just seems to be something that Doctor Who's almost took on in a tradition over the last few years, but I think that certainly giving it to a different writer would be a good idea. So now moving on to the characters for this story, of course we have the 13th Doctor as portrayed by Jodie Whittaker, and a lot of people have been saying this is the breakthrough moment for her Doctor. They kind of felt like she was a lot more doctorly, if that is a word, and she did have some absolutely brilliant moments, it must be said. I love the interaction scenes in the early first act of this story, where you first meet the aliens for this episode, and you have her confronting them. I really like that. I thought that when she said, "I know who you are, I know what you do, you should get off this planet," I felt like that was really good, very serious at the same time, but also at the same time of being serious, there was some really nice comparisons of having a very friendly Doctor, and certainly having a lot of bonding relationships with her different companions, especially throughout this story. Her relationship with Yaz was certainly very much emphasised, especially almost the equivalent of a hen night in the Punjab, I suppose, the night before the wedding, where they were doing the henna on the hands, and she made the joke about sort of gender, her gender is kind of just a joke or something, and she's using it as a joke, and she's such a comedian. I quite liked that. It was funny, kind of, it was quite obviously referencing out of the actual programme itself, I think, nearly breaking the fourth wall to some extent, but I think that this episode's certainly built on the relationship that we have with Yaz, and I kind of feel like the other companions were left to the back, which we'll come on to, of course, in a little bit. The 13th Doctor throughout this episode almost took on a professor-like role. I really love the idea of her being obsessed with making things. Of course, in the episode she built that device, which from what I understood was basically a Punjab version of a sort of house-made Bunsen burner, where she could actually burn the material or the gas or something like that and find out what the substance actually was. I really loved that. I was getting some Third Doctor vibes from her at that point. I think in particular that moment, I think it was in the Time Monster, where the Third Doctor makes that time device basically out of like corks and bottles and balancing them on top of each other. I think a fork was in there as well, it used to spin round or something. I thought that the idea of using household materials in order to create a device was quite cool, and the 13th Doctor is a rather lovable Doctor, but importantly incredibly vulnerable, and that is something that I have touched on in previous reviews, because one of the main comparisons I can give for this story is of course Father's Day in Doctor Who Series 1, and that story had a lot of backfire around it. The Doctor was incredibly worried that Rose would in fact go and affect time and change the course of events, and it was understandable. That story did in fact really nicely encapsulate the idea of risks of going back in time and the ways that you can change time, such as the Reapers. It did very much focus around that. However, this episode does the complete opposite. I kind of feel like it was a bit too easy. I think that generally going back in time and Yaz going to see Umbrian for the first time, I thought that that was generally too easy, just so happening to land right near where she lives, then finding her within the first few minutes, and then being right on the wedding. It just all seemed incredibly coincidental, and then the actual idea of being involved within that time period. There is a few moments where the Doctor says, "Be careful, you are treading on your own timeline," or something like that, but that is virtually it. It didn't really feel like a risk, it didn't feel like any laws of time were being broken, which it was being broken throughout this story, and especially throughout the early moments of this episode, especially in the TARDIS scene at the very beginning, where Yaz actually shows the Doctor the watch and the story behind it, and saying that she wants to go back in time. time, she didn't really categorically deny it and say, no, we are not doing that, but instead she kind of opened her eyes and thought, yeah, let's do it, which I thought was very unusual and certainly something that previous Doctors wouldn't have done. Now moving on to the companions, of course we have Yaz, played by Mandeep Gill. I think that this is the first review I've in fact ever covered her first when it came to the companions. And yeah, in this story, it did in fact let her character develop a little bit further. That is something that will come naturally because this is a story completely dedicated to her past. But at the same time, I kind of feel like it could have been a bit more emotional for her. I did certainly feel like she learnt quite a lot throughout the story, certainly the idea of learning the story behind the watch, and I like the idea of returning back to her grandmother at the end of the story, and her saying, do you want to know about the watch? And then she simply says no, because she's already found out for herself. And I think that this story is a great way of making a more personal connection with the companion. It is a great way to in fact give them a lot of development and actually say this is why you should like them, and for that reason I do think that episodes like this do belong in the early half of the season. I think if anything, this should have been around maybe episode 3 or episode 4. Other than that, I do think that this episode is certainly one of her standout episodes for this season. It certainly feels like she's stepping into her character a little bit more, and it's getting to the point now that I'm expecting her to be in season 12 along with Graham and along with Tosin Cole as Ryan, so I'm just hoping that that series maybe is dedicated a bit more to actually making characters feel a little bit more like people. Now moving on to the other companions, you have Ryan Sinclair, played by Tosin Cole, and this is the moment of the episode review where we literally just pause and don't say anything, because I virtually don't have anything to say at all. Because I kind of feel like Ryan has stepped into the shoes of Yaz for this episode, where Yaz is normally the one to do absolutely nothing and contribute absolutely nothing. In this story, Ryan was kind of just there to say a few lines, kind of just be involved in the story. However, he did also fade into the background. He could have easily been a piece of furniture. He wasn't needed in the actual episode. There wasn't any requirement for him to be in the actual story. And I also feel like this episode should have offered some development with him and Yaz and that relationship that they have, because they're around the same age. Therefore, they can kind of relate to each other. They've known each other since school. Therefore, a story like this maybe should have developed that. However, it didn't. Moving on to Graham, of course played by Bradley Walsh. Once again, for the first time this season, I don't particularly have much to say about him. I kind of feel like this story was completely dedicated to Yaz, which I think is certainly good by this point, considering that it's episode 6. And we virtually had hardly any development of Yaz so far as of yet. But yeah, Graham, the one scene that I can kind of say that I liked him in would have been the moment when he was with Yaz, kind of outside the barn or the house, and they have a little conversation about her not being her grandmother yet, which I thought that was quite nice. And also the early half of this story where they're first in the historical setting, and he says something like, I can sing all the classics and things like that. I thought that was quite nice. And also the moment in the TARDIS very earlier on when he says something like, I'm not just here to be insulted, or something like that, in a funny jokey way. I kind of feel like he doesn't have much to do. However, his presence is funny, nice and warm, and that enough possibly gets away with him being in this story, I suppose. He is a nice contribution, however, once again, much like Ryan, nothing too detrimental to the actual plot. The character that I'm in fact going to talk about really for this review is Amita Suman, who plays Umbreen, the younger version of Umbreen. I thought that she was certainly the best supporting character for this story. She portrayed a really innocent, younger female character, but also one of which that wanted to break the rules of the tradition, and I do really like that. It is characters like that that do, of course, go on to change history and go and do different things. We've seen that so far already this season with Rosa Parks, and the way that one opinion and one kind of divided idea of I want to do this, therefore I am going to do it, does in fact lead on to the changing path of history. So I do think that she was a rather powerful character. To be honest, was the only character of the family that I kind of liked. I think that Prem, who's played by Shane Zazar, I think that he was fun. I liked him. I thought that he was sort of likeable. He played a good character at the end of the story in that final scene. I thought that that was very good. But other than that, nothing really too stand out. And same goes for the rest of the family as well. I didn't really feel like I had much much sort of care for them at all. I didn't really feel like I connected with them. So yeah, it would have been nice to maybe have a bit more development to make me care, but that said, at the same time, you know, this episode kind of had a lot of characters to handle in the first place, much like the majority of this series, to be honest. All the characters are out the way, taking a look at the actual narrative of this story. Once again, I've spent a lot of time focused around the characters because this is a very character-based story. The actual narrative itself, as I was saying earlier, isn't really anything original. The whole idea of the artifact was incredibly nice, being the watch and then going back in time to learn the story behind it. And I think that Partition India is also a brilliant choice in theme. So far from what I can recall, we've never seen that in Doctor Who, so I really do like the fact that we're going to a different country. I like the fact that it's a historical setting, and I like the fact that it goes to a piece of history that may not be known by a lot of people. I think that this episode, one of the main things I can take from it is that it was educational. I felt like I learnt something. There is in fact a few occasions throughout this story where the Doctor does mention a few facts, such as the fact that 1 million or so people will die, and also generally the actual premise around what Partition India is about. And I feel that this story does do a very good job of working in the actual educational aspects of the episode, which is one of the moments in the early half of this story where one of the characters references feeding back the information to Lord Mountbatten, of course with the Doctor and her companions being English in the actual story. They're almost a little bit of the enemy, however not officially the enemy, which I think is a rather nice aspect to sort of contribute to the episode, but also at the same time, I kind of feel like this episode could have offered a bit more of a stark reality, because I feel like there was a lot of going on around this time period of 1947. I feel like within the actual cities, of course, there was a lot of riots and fights going on. In fact, when I was watching this episode for the second time, I did Google what it actually looked like in that time period and sort of the fights, as I say, and the riots that were actually taking place. Something of which that we did get reference to on the radio in the later half of the story before the people on horseback did arrive. However, I kind of feel like this story should have took the approach where Ryan and Graham went off to the city to see how that was actually unfolding there, and maybe get caught up within the actual riot itself, and then Yaz and the Doctor are with her family and maybe doing a little bit of a split divide story. It's something of which that I would kind of relate to 60s Doctor Who, even though I do think that this episode is very 60s already, the actual setting and the educational aspect behind it, but I feel like they could have been a bit more involved in the time period, and certainly the lack in using the riots and the fighting and the actual sort of mention of the people who die. I feel like that could have been used, and it was certainly a missed opportunity. Something of which I almost feel that if this was a Big Finish main range story, that would without a doubt be included. One of the companions would be split off and they will go and see the riots, and then the other Doctor or the other companion will be with the family or something like that, so you'll get two sides of the story. Something of which is also relevant in the current Doctor Who Series 11 books. All the characters have different jobs and different things to do, which so far I am not seeing that for this series. It kind of feels like all the companions need to be together and they're kind of glued at the waist, and I kind of feel like they need to go and do their own thing. Moving on to the villain of this story, who knows? I needed to in fact wiki what they were called, but I didn't really take much notice of them throughout the entire story, because once again we are on to episode 6 and we do not have a villain or monster that is an actual villain or monster. Actual involvement within the episode I do think was certainly interesting. I like the idea of them originally being assassins, and then kind of the loss of their planet has made them change their ways, and now kind of they are the equivalent of, I do believe, witnesses it was referred to in the actual story, or they may be priests to some extent as well, that go and see people in their last few moments. That is all lovely and jolly. However, they don't have much to do, and once again, episode 6 of Doctor Who Series 11, and we've not had a monster, we've not had a villain that is an actual villain, and it's really annoying. We had the Pating last week, which we've all, if you see my review of that, you will know how much I love that creature. It is not a monster, it is not a villain, it's not evil, it's just a thing. Then you have racism in the previous story, which yes, you could kind of call that a villain to some extent. It is a non-physical entity villain. Literally the closest that we've got to an actual monster this year that Doctor Who is known for is Tim Shaw. And Tim Shaw, in that review, I even stated that he was underdeveloped, and he is the kind of character that you would see in the opening episode for a new Doctor, where they don't take the forefront, the attention isn't completely around them, and we've still not seen a monster. It just baffles me, because by this point in the series we should have at least seen two, and I kind of feel like this episode should have done the thing that you all know I'm going to say next. It's a historical setting. This episode should have been a pure historical. This episode had more potential to be a pure historical than Rosa being a pure historical, because fair dues, the episode of Rosa had the racist alien from the future in that was trying to change time, and if you were to take him out of the story, it would have took a lot of reworking. A lot of the components would have need changing. However, with this story, you could have very easily, with very little effort, actually removed whatever they're called, and it wouldn't have had any change whatsoever. You could have had a pure historical where the Doctor takes one of her friends to go and see one of their relatives, they get caught up in the historical setting, perfect 60s style Doctor Who, it's educational, doesn't have the pointless villain in, and also, the bit where you remove the alien can then be the bit that you dedicate to the fights and the chaos and the riots breaking out in the city, the stuff that was referred to within the radio broadcasts, and then you get a full perspective of that historical setting without an alien that isn't the Doctor in sight. You would deliver your first pure historical in years, and it would also be a rather strong story that is focused around one of the main companions, and it would have really worked. It could have been essentially one of the highlights of, well, it is already one of the highlights of the season, but it's just so annoying how close once again that this episode was to being a pure historical, and it could have been better if it was a pure historical. And there's just this weird sort of scare tactic around new series Doctor Who around not doing pure historicals, and it is an opportunity that is being missed every single series. I think, once again, a missed opportunity that should have been used. One of the ending moments for this story was of course the moment where Prem, the husband, does of course get killed. It was very powerful. I loved the directing in that scene, especially the Doctor and her friends walking away and you hear the gunshot in the background. I think that one of the main things that you can praise Doctor Who Series 11 for doing is in fact that there has been quite a few casualties and quite a few deaths. I don't think an episode has gone by without a death taking place, which is very good. It suits my grim soul incredibly nicely, but I think that it's good. It's a good way to learn a threat, and also for a pure historical story, it shows that the actual setting is dangerous and the humans in the story are the actual monster, which is kind of what I understand a lot of people have been saying. The aliens weren't the monster in this story, the humans were, and the whole idea of sort of racial purity and dividing people up into their different religions, which if that was the case, if it was to make the humans look like the main monsters and the main villains, take them out completely. And then you've got the humans being the monsters, which I think that this episode does make it a little bit weaker for, but I think that after multiple watches, this episode does become a lot stronger. It's certainly one of the strongest stories of this season, simply because it does something different for Doctor Who, but not necessarily different for the science fiction format. Just as a little bit of a side on, I'm aware that the camera has probably completely changed angles. That is because I've literally just finished filming and I was going to go and render all the footage and edit it, and then I realised one pivotal issue that I didn't talk about with this episode, and it is the use of this. It is getting way too much. It is ridiculous. I would actually dare say it is worse than the 11th Doctor in Series 5. She's just constantly using it for everything. And yes, it is a rather unique and interesting design, and yes, she has a rather personal relationship with her sonic screwdriver in a non-weird way, but I kind of feel like we're seeing this too much. She's using it too much for meaningless tasks, and I think that if she just stops even the random buzzing with no context, then that will make the episodes a bit better. But I want to see less of this in the future because it's driving me mad already. We're on to episode 6 and I'm sick of the sight of the thing. So yeah, tone it down, and I'm going to go edit now. If we go into the other production credits for this story, Segan Akinola, it's time for his praise of this episode review. After last week, we didn't really have too much to praise him on. He did a wonderful job throughout this story. I actually think that Segan, this is probably some of his best stuff from the series so far. I love the fact that it was incredibly sort of relating to the actual setting. It did feel like Punjab music. I can't remember what they actually refer to it as, like the technical term in their music, but I think that it certainly was nice. It was atmospheric and it was stylized certainly around the period setting that they were in, so it was very nice to support the visuals incredibly well. I did also love the scenes that were directed by Jamie Childs that had no scripting in whatsoever from the actual people talking, and it just had the location. I thought that was very nice, especially the exterior establishing shots of when the TARDIS first arrived. That lovely scene was great. You could have had a lot of actual promotional material, I think, based around that. I think this story could have been a good opportunity to, in fact, promote for Doctor Who Series 11, as it looked visually nice. The landscape's lovely as well, and it just makes it look a lot different. It's a setting that Doctor Who isn't normally used to going to, but Segan did certainly do a good job. Moving on to the end of the story, after my negative response in episode 3 to the music over the end theme, which we had Rise Up, which didn't really fit whatsoever, I did kind of like it within the actual story, however not on the end credits. This episode we had the sort of different version of the Doctor Who theme over the normal Doctor Who theme, and yeah, I thought to start with I didn't like it. However, on second viewing, I thought it was quite nice. It was quite atmospheric, but also at the same time, I thought it was odd that the ending was that style of music. However, the opening wasn't. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted the opening to be in that style of music. I just think that wouldn't have suited it whatsoever. But yeah, I kind of guess it was a nice take. It's unique. But yeah, I didn't really like it too much on first viewing. But I kind of liked it on second a little bit. It's quite nice, you know, it's a nice relaxing version. Would be nice to maybe have an extended version at some point, but as to actually going over the theme itself, I don't think I like that bit. Also, may have been nice to have the Doctor's theme maybe jazzed up a bit, because so far I don't think we've had a definitive version of that soundtrack yet, unlike how we've had with pretty much all of the new series Doctors. Yeah, that is my review of Doctor Who Series 11 Episode 6, Demons of the Punjab. I think that generally overall, this episode is certainly unique in its approach when it comes to Doctor Who. I like the fact that it is a slow burner to start with and takes a lot to actually try and get going, because it has a lot of characters to establish and the setting to establish as well. But I think that certainly on multiple rewatches, this episode does become quite a powerful story and a powerful tale, delivering quite a nice historical message. I think that the setting is great, the directing is lovely, and some of the scenes, such as the marriage and the death scene as well, are incredibly powerful. I love the Doctor's speeches. I think that this episode certainly sees the 13th Doctor in a different light. It's no coincidence that the two best stories I think the Doctor has acted in so far this year has been Rosa and Demons of the Punjab, two episodes that haven't been written by the head writer. So I think that certainly on that basis we could be looking forward to quite a few decent episodes in the future half of Series 11 to perform a different version of the 13th Doctor, and I hope there's something that is took on in feedback for the later seasons as well. I want more variety when it comes to writing, because more variety means more interesting stories, and we don't get this lull that we've had at the early half of this season because it is entirely written by Chibnall. So overall, a nice story. I really do respect it. However, quite a lot of it also has missed opportunities, such as using the historical setting. You could have took the villain out completely, and generally it just could have been a bit more engaging, I suppose. Yeah, not necessarily the best, but certainly a respectable story, so it is probably up there as one of my favourites from this season. Next week for Doctor Who Series 11, we travel into the far future as we take a look at the Doctor in fact receiving a parcel, and they end up going to a random space place that delivers parcels and post, and we have a robotic postman, and it basically has the 7th Doctor era written all over it. It's got like the Happiness Patrol, the dodgy androids, Dragonfire, Delta and Genus. We've got Limac in there. It's going to be an exciting looking story, and just to make that even better, it's called Kablam, which if that doesn't excite you enough, then I don't know what will. But I'm really looking forward to next week's, because I've got a feeling, a very good feeling, that it is going to be a gem, but also at the same time it could backfire, which I hope it doesn't. but it does look quite cool. That is that for this review. I hope you've enjoyed it. Join me next week for my next Doctor Who Series 11 episode review, and join me later this week for more Doctor Who content from Doctor Who Series 11 books, Big Finish, product reviews, and much more that I will be covering over the channel in the coming weeks. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.